On May 29th, 1925, a British explorer sat in a jungle camp he called Dead Horse Camp and wrote a letter to his wife. He told her he was in good health. He told her the expedition was going well. And then he wrote one sentence that historians have spent a century trying to explain away. He wrote that if he found what he expected to find, the whole story of the Americas would need to be rewritten. Not might need revision. Would need to be rewritten. He sealed the letter, handed it to a native runner, and walked into the forest with his son and one other man. He was never seen again. Neither were they. In the 100 years since that letter, more than 100 people searching for him have died trying to find out what he found. Not what happened to him, what he found. Because here is the detail that gets lost every time this story gets told as a ghost story or a jungle curse. Percy Fawcett was not a fantasist. He was a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, a trained surveyor who had already completed 7 official expeditions into South America, mapping rivers no European map had ever recorded. This was not a man who saw things that weren't there. So when a man with that reputation spends the final years of his career becoming increasingly certain that a lost civilization is sitting in the Brazilian interior, and when the institutions that trained him respond not by investigating, but by immediately, within months of his disappearance, issuing a statement designed to discredit him before anyone could confirm what he found, you have to ask the only question that actually matters. What was down there that needed to stay hidden that badly? Let's go back further, because Fawcett was not the beginning of this. In 1541, a Spanish conquistador named Francisco de Orellana became the first European to travel the entire length of the Amazon River. His chronicler, a Dominican friar named Gaspar de Carvajal, kept a detailed journal of everything he saw, and what he recorded was not wilderness. He described cities stretching along the riverbanks for kilometers, populations he estimated in the hundreds of thousands, organized roads connecting settlements, and in one specific passage, towers of white stone visible from the river. For 400 years, mainstream historians dismissed Carvajal as a liar, a friar exaggerating to impress his superiors back in Spain. Here is the problem with that explanation. Carvajal was describing something checkable, something any future expedition could verify or disprove. Why would a man whose entire credibility depended on honest religious testimony invent cities that could be exposed as fiction the moment someone else went looking? He wouldn't. And modern archaeology has quietly, reluctantly, started proving he didn't have to, because the Amazon is now known to contain something called terra preta, black earth, fertile, self-regenerating soil that does not occur naturally. It was engineered, built into the ground by human hands at a scale spanning enormous portions of the basin, in exactly the places Carvajal described dense populations. Someone built a soil system designed to keep producing food for centuries after the people who made it were gone, and it's still working today. Now here's where the story gets uncomfortable, because this isn't just an old Spanish account anymore. In 1913, Theodore Roosevelt, a former president of the United States, co-led a Brazilian expedition with an army colonel named Candido Rondon. Roosevelt published his own account of that trip, a book called Through the Brazilian Wilderness, and buried in his own memoir is one line that should have been a bigger story than it ever became. Roosevelt writes that Rondon showed him certain features of the landscape that he was specifically asked not to include in the published account. A former U.S. president, in his own book, admits he was told by a Brazilian officer to leave something out of the historical record. And he agreed. What did Rondon show him? Roosevelt never says. Rondon, in his own extensive writings across decades, never returns to it either. It just sits there. A gap, hiding in plain sight, inside one of the most famous published expedition accounts in American history, and nobody followed up on it for a century. Fast forward to the 1990s and 2000s. Deforestation in the Brazilian state of Acre starts stripping away tree cover, and what it reveals underneath had been hidden for centuries. Geometric earthworks, circles, squares, octagons, some nearly 300 meters wide, carved directly into the earth across an area of roughly 13,000 square kilometers. Nobody argues these are natural. The debate is only about what they were for. The official explanation is ceremonial gathering spaces. But researchers working largely outside mainstream funding have noticed something the official explanation conveniently skips. These geoglyphs sit consistently at the exact boundaries of the terra preta soil zones and the areas with abnormally high concentrations of domesticated fruit and nut trees. Brazil nut, cacao, peach palm, species that don't need to be replanted every season, that keep producing on their own, generation after generation. Which raises the actual question nobody in the mainstream wants to sit with. What if this wasn't wilderness the Amazon tribes happen to live near? What if this was infrastructure, a managed, engineered landscape built by a civilization that didn't clear the forest to survive, but designed the forest itself as the technology? And this is exactly what Fawcett said he was looking for, in his own handwriting, in letters that still exist in the Royal Geographical Society archive today. In a letter from 1921, he described what indigenous informants from multiple unconnected language groups had independently told him. Stone construction, elevated roadways, evidence of hydraulic engineering, and one phrase, buried in that letter for over 100 years before anyone thought to connect it to the Terra Preta research. Cultivated growth of an unusual character. Not wild, not domestic. Something in between. Fawcett wasn't looking for ruins in the way people assume. He said explicitly he expected to find something that might not even be recognizable as human construction, because it had been built to work with nature instead of against it. A civilization that built with the forest, not instead of it. That is precisely, word for word, what modern soil scientists and archaeologists are now cautiously starting to describe. A man in 1921, with no satellite data, no soil chemistry lab, working entirely from oral testimony gathered on foot in the jungle, wrote down the exact shape of what would take modern science another 100 years to even begin proving. So what happened to him? Within months of his disappearance in 1925, the Royal Geographical Society issued a statement calling his expedition a private venture undertaken against institutional advice. Technically true, but look at what that statement actually does. If Fawcett found nothing, he's remembered as a romantic who died chasing a fantasy. If he found something, well, the institution had already, preemptively, put it on record that he wasn't operating with incredible scientific bounds. Heads they win, tails he loses. Every rescue expedition sent after him ran into the same wall. Terrain, disease, and in at least 2 documented cases, direct intervention by Brazilian military authorities, citing sovereignty concerns and indigenous protection. Both legitimate reasons on paper. That's exactly what makes them so effective as a wall. You cannot publicly argue against protecting indigenous communities. You cannot argue against a nation's sovereignty over its own territory. But the outcome, every single time, in the specific coordinates Fawcett indicated, was the same. The search stopped. The map stayed blank. And it's not just Fawcett's coordinates. Anna Roosevelt, granddaughter of Theodore Roosevelt, and a credentialed peer-reviewed archaeologist, excavated Marijo Island at the mouth of the Amazon in the late 1980s and found dense, long-term settlement evidence and ceramic sophistication that fundamentally challenged the accepted model of pre-contact Amazonia. It was published, peer-reviewed, cited, and then absorbed into the literature without the textbook revision that a discovery of that scale should have triggered. LiDAR surveys over Cambodia in 2012 tripled the known size of the ancient city of Angkor overnight. Published. Celebrated briefly in the science press. Absorbed. No public reckoning. The pattern is not suppression in the dramatic, secret agent sense. It's something quieter and arguably more effective. Acknowledge, publish, narrow the framing, and let it sit in the literature where the public will never encounter it. Meanwhile, the modern Brazilian territories with the tightest restricted access, run today by the Indigenous Protection Agency FUNAI, line up with striking geographic precision over the exact zones Fawcett identified as most likely to hold what he was looking for. Not all protected territories. These specific ones. Brazilian archaeologists have noted this in careful academic language, using a phrase that shows up again and again in the footnotes. Access constraints have limited systematic survey of the most promising areas. Read that sentence slowly. It is protecting real people, and it is also, conveniently, sealing the exact ground Fawcett was walking toward when he vanished. So here's where this leaves us. A 400-year-old friar's testimony that was called a lie until soil science proved the soil itself was engineered. A former U.S. president who admitted in his own book he was asked to hide something and complied. A trained, credentialed surveyor who wrote in his own hand that finding what he expected would force the whole story of the Americas to be rewritten, and then disappeared into exactly the region where the evidence keeps surfacing anyway. Geoglyphs the size of small cities, discovered only because a chainsaw exposed them, and 100 years of researchers dying, funding drying up, and access being denied for reasons that are each, individually, completely reasonable. It's the pattern that isn't reasonable. Not one silence. All of them, stacked in the same place, over the same century. Around the same set of coordinates a man once called Z. Fawcett walked toward something he believed would rewrite everything we think we know about who was here first, and what they built, and how advanced they actually were. He never came back to tell us what it was. But the forest is still there. The soil is still producing. And somewhere in that basin, the thing he was walking toward is still exactly where he left it, waiting for someone the institutions can't discredit before they arrive.